He wasn't a monster from fiction, he was real. A prince who ruled with terror so absolute that even the devil would have flinched. They called him Vlad the Impaler, the man who turned execution into art and fear into power. His enemies said he drank blood. His people said he saved their souls. Both were right. This is the true story behind Dracula, the ruler who dined among corpses, who impaled armies, and whose cruelty built an empire of silence. Before we begin, subscribe now, because history doesn't just tell stories, it remembers the monsters who refused to die. They called him Vlad Țepeș, Vlad the Impaler, the man whose cruelty would one day give birth to the legend of Dracula. But before the myths, before the horror stories whispered across Europe, there was only a prince, a man forged by betrayal, war, and a belief that fear was the purest form of power. This is not a tale of a monster born from darkness. It's the story of a ruler who created it, one execution at a time. In the 15th century, the land of Wallachia was a wound between two empires, the Christian kingdoms of the west and the Ottoman Empire pressing from the east. Armies marched across its fields every decade. Loyalty shifted with the wind. For a young prince like Vlad, survival meant understanding one truth: mercy was a language his enemies did not speak. Vlad was the son of Vlad Dracula, a member of the Order of the Dragon, a knightly brotherhood sworn to defend Christianity against the Turks. Dracula meant dragon, and from that name came Dracula, meaning son of the dragon. But for the people of Wallachia, the name would come to mean something far darker. Vlad III would carry his father's title and twist its meaning until even dragons would fear it. When Vlad's father sent him as a political hostage to the Ottoman court, the boy's childhood ended overnight. He learned quickly that power did not come from compassion, but from the terror it inspired. The Turks impaled rebels outside their walls as a warning. Vlad watched, silent, absorbing every scream. Those lessons would follow him home like ghosts. Years later, when he returned to claim his father's throne, he found his homeland rotting in treachery. The boyars, Wallachian nobles, had betrayed his father and murdered his elder brother. They ruled the country like vultures, feasting on its remains. Vlad saw not men of state, but disease that had to be cut away. To rule a land of wolves, he believed, one must become the hungriest of them all. And so began the transformation, from prince to punisher, from victim to terror. Vlad swore that every act of betrayal would be answered with agony. Every whisper of rebellion would end on a stake. He would purify Wallachia in blood until fear itself bent the knee. But what began as vengeance soon became his religion. He no longer killed to defend his crown, he killed to define it. Every execution was a sermon, every impalement a scripture. By the time the world called him the Impaler, his enemies no longer saw a man, they saw judgment. A ruler who believed that peace was not born from mercy, but from the silence that followed 1,000 screams. The prince had become something more than mortal. He had become a myth, and myths, unlike men, never die. Before he was a prince, before he was feared across kingdoms, Vlad Dracula was a prisoner. At just 11 years old, he and his younger brother, Radu, were taken hostage by the Ottoman Empire, a political bargain sealed in fear. Their father, Vlad Dracula, had pledged loyalty to the Sultan, but was caught between Christian kings and Turkish sultans. To ensure his obedience, his sons became collateral living insurance that their father would not betray his oath. In the fortress of Egrigos, surrounded by men who spoke a foreign tongue, Vlad learned that a prince's worth was not in his blood, but in his usefulness. He was not tortured, at least not at first. The Ottomans were smarter than that. They didn't need whips to break a boy. They used isolation, uncertainty, and the sound of death outside his window. Every morning, prisoners, rebels, thieves, soldiers were impaled in the courtyards below. The stench of blood, the crows circling overhead, these became Vlad's tutors. While other boys learned chess or scripture, Vlad learned the anatomy of pain. He studied how long a man could live on the stake, how the screams changed when the lungs began to collapse, how terror could silence a crowd faster than any sword. The Turks thought they were teaching him obedience. Instead, they taught him mastery. His brother Radu, gentle and charming, adapted quickly. The Ottomans called him Radu the Handsome. He was favored, educated, even admired by the Sultan's court. But Vlad was different. proud, cold, unyielding. He watched Radu smile, speak their language, wear their robes. To Vlad, every kindness was poison, every courtesy, a chain. He saw his brother's submission not as survival, but betrayal. The years of captivity twisted something inside him. He learned to hide his hatred behind stillness, to speak softly so no one could hear his thoughts. The young prince became a vessel of silence and rage, his heart carved into patience. He would endure anything, but he would never kneel. Then one day, news arrived from home. His father and elder brother had been betrayed, murdered by Wallachian nobles. Vlad's hands shook as he heard the tale. His father buried alive, his brother's eyes gouged out before death. The boy who had been a hostage became a hollow thing. In that moment he made a vow, not to God, not to family, but to vengeance. Years later, when the Sultan released him to reclaim his throne, Vlad did not look back. The Ottomans thought they were sending home a broken prince. They had no idea they were unleashing a man who had studied their cruelties and improved upon them. The hostage had returned to Wallachia, not as a victim of captivity, but as the architect of terror. Because, when you teach a boy to live among monsters, he does not fear them. He learns to become one. When Vlad returned to Wallachia, he did not come home. He came to reclaim a graveyard. His father was gone, his brother mutilated, and the boyars, the noble families who had once sworn loyalty, were still feasting on the ruins of his family's power. The throne that should have been his by blood had become a game piece in a kingdom where betrayal was currency. But Vlad was not the same boy who had left. The hostage had learned patience. The prince had learned vengeance. He began small quiet gestures, polite alliances, and whispers of loyalty. His rivals underestimated him. To them, he was just another pretender, a forgotten son returned to a fractured realm. But behind his calm gaze, he carried a ledger of names, men who had betrayed his father, abandoned his brother, and fed on the blood of his house. And one by one, he began to erase them. When he finally took the throne, it was not through open war. It was through manipulation, intimidation, and calculated cruelty. Vlad had discovered something few rulers ever understood. Fear was more efficient than armies. He decreed that loyalty would not be requested. It would be proven, and those who failed the test would be taught obedience in ways that would never be forgotten. The first to fall were the boyars of Targovite. On Easter Sunday, the nobles were invited to a grand feast in the royal court. They came dressed in their finest silks, laughing, confident that the young prince wanted reconciliation. But as they drank and ate, the doors were barred and soldiers filled the hall. Vlad rose from his seat and, in a voice colder than steel, asked them a question. "How many princes have you buried?" No one answered. He didn't need them to. The soldiers dragged the old and the young from their seats. The strongest were marched for days to the mountains, forced to build his fortress, Poinari Castle, until their bodies gave out. The weakest, he ordered, impaled outside the city walls as a warning. The message was unmistakable. Treachery would not be forgiven. It would be displayed. And Wallachia would never forget what loyalty cost. This was the birth of Vlad the Impaler, the Impaler. Not a madman, not yet, but a ruler who understood that terror could be engineered like architecture. The stakes were his pillars, the corpses his warning signs. Foreign envoys began sending back reports filled with horror and fascination. They spoke of a prince who dined in silence while the condemned writhed behind him, a man who saw execution not as punishment, but as policy. The throne of Wallachia was no longer just a seat of power. It had become an altar, and Vlad was its high priest, offering human souls in the name of order. The boy who once watched impalements as a captive now commanded them as a king. The hostage had become the master, and the world had no idea what kind of nightmare he was about to build. There are moments in history so grotesque, so deliberate, that they stop armies in their tracks. For Vlad Țepeș, that moment came in 1462, when the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, marched upon Wallachia with an army nearly 100,000 strong. It was meant to be a show of power, a lesson to a defiant vassal prince. But what the Sultan found outside the walls of Targovite was not resistance, it was revelation. Stretching for miles along the roadside was a sight no chronicler could fully describe. A forest of bodies, 20,000 men, women, and children, each impaled on sharpened stakes. Soldiers, merchants, peasants, prisoners, all displayed with surgical precision. Their corpses swayed gently in the wind, a grotesque imitation of life. The stakes were arranged in rows like orchards, each one a silent sermon about what happened to those who challenged the Prince of Wallachia. Eyewitnesses from the Sultan's army recorded that even hardened soldiers turned pale. Some vomited. Others crossed themselves, though many were Muslim. When Mehmed himself saw the field, he ordered his men to halt. Before them, impaled high upon a massive stake in the center, was the body of the Turkish governor of Nicopolis. Vlad's message to the Sultan himself. The Ottoman invasion faltered. It wasn't a victory of weapons, it was a victory of terror. Vlad had learned that the most efficient battle is one that never has to be fought. Fear, he realized, moved faster than any cavalry. To the people of Wallachia, this horror was both a curse and a shield. Under Vlad's rule, theft was almost non-existent. Peasants left gold cups at public fountains, and no one dared touch them. The roads were safe. Justice was absolute. But the cost of that order was silence, no laughter in the markets, no singing in the taverns, just the hum of fear. Yet to Vlad this was not cruelty, it was balance. The world had betrayed him once, and he would never allow chaos to return. Every stake was a declaration, I am the law. Foreign visitors tried to rationalize what they saw. A papal envoy wrote that Vlad was a man both God-fearing and diabolical. The contradiction was the key to his rule. He saw himself not as a sadist, but as God's executioner. Each impaled body was, in his mind, a soul purified through pain. But behind the divine justification was something darker. The hostage who had once stood helpless before the impalements of the Ottomans was now recreating them on a scale so vast it dwarfed even his captor's cruelty. His vengeance had become an art. When word of the forest of the impaled reached Europe, it spread like wildfire. The Germans printed woodcuts depicting the nightmare. Vlad seated among the dead, calmly eating lunch while the condemned twisted in agony around him. The image became legend, a grotesque mirror of a man who ruled not through love or respect, but through terror perfected. Mehmed retreated. Wallachia was safe for a time, but Vlad's triumph was poisoned. His own people began to whisper. Fear protected them from enemies, but it also divided them from their prince. The man who had made them safe had also made them slaves to dread. Still, Vlad stood by his creed, better a silent kingdom than a disloyal one. The forest of the impaled had done its work. The Sultan had fled. And the world now knew that Wallachia's ruler was not a man to be challenged. He was a message written in blood. The chroniclers called it the banquet of the dead, a scene so vile that even his enemies struggled to believe it until they saw it with their own eyes. It was said that Vlad the Impaler once held a feast in the middle of his own execution ground, a royal table surrounded by the impaled bodies of his victims. The air thick with death, the screams echoing across the fields, and there, in the center of it all, their prince eating calmly as if among honored guests. The story spread across Europe, carried by travelers, merchants, and spies who had seen too much to forget. They said he tore bread with his hands, dipped it in wine, and raised his cup to the dying as if toasting their sins. When a servant gagged at the sight, Vlad had him impaled on the spot, then continued his meal in silence. For him, this was not madness. It was message. To Vlad, pain and fear were not byproducts of rule. They were the very instruments of it. The feast was not indulgence, it was demonstration. He wanted his people, his soldiers, even his enemies to understand that terror was his court language, and he was fluent. He had built a kingdom where obedience meant life, and hesitation meant the stake. He ruled as a god of punishment, calm, absolute, terrifyingly composed. He believed a ruler should be both merciful and merciless, choosing which to be as carefully as one chooses which blade to sharpen. The feast was theater, and every corpse an actor in his grand display of order. The stakes around him weren't random. They were arranged by rank, by crime, by social status. The nobles closest to him on the field, the peasants farther away. It was a hierarchy of horror, a reflection of his worldview disciplined through design. And yet, amid all this control, one detail haunts the legend. Some say that as the night deepened, the prince paused, staring at a single stake where a young man still gasped for air. His eyes followed the dying man's until they met. For the briefest moment, witnesses claimed, Vlad's expression softened, not in pity, but in something stranger, recognition. Then, he looked away. By dawn, the field was silent again. The last cries had faded, leaving only the flutter of banners and the distant echo of crows. Vlad rose from his seat, his robe unstained, his face untroubled. To his enemies, this was proof of monstrosity. To his followers, proof of divine conviction. To history, it became the image of a man who had crossed the final line between ruler and God. Because when a man can dine among the dying and still taste his food, he no longer rules through fear. He has become fear itself. To understand Vlad the Impaler, one must understand the stake. It was not simply a tool of death, it was his signature, his language, his weapon of choice. While most rulers executed their enemies quickly, Vlad sought to engineer death itself. He didn't just kill, he performed it. Impalement was not chaos, it was choreography. The process began with precision. The stake was carved smooth, long enough to pierce a human body from end to end, yet thick enough to hold it upright. It was sometimes greased to ensure the victim would slide cleanly. Vlad insisted on efficiency, not mercy. The point was rarely sharpened to a knife's edge. A blunt tip caused less bleeding, prolonging life. The goal was not speed. It was endurance. The condemned would be stripped, bound, and lifted. The stake was placed between the legs, often inserted through the rectum or the vagina, and driven upward, carefully avoiding vital organs. In skilled hands, the stake could pass through the torso, exit near the shoulder or mouth, and miss the heart entirely. The victim could live for hours, sometimes even days. And Vlad's men were very skilled. As the victim struggled, the body would eventually settle under its own weight, sliding down the stake inch by inch. Muscles tore. The lungs filled with fluid. Nerves fired endlessly until the brain gave out. All the while, the prince's soldiers watched in silence, learning the cost of disobedience. To an outsider, this was cruelty beyond reason. But to Vlad, it was discipline made visible. Each impaled body was both a punishment and a warning. He saw it as a tool of order, a way to govern the living through the suffering of the condemned. The more public the display, the stronger the message. The execution grounds became his court, and every stake a law written in flesh. Foreign envoys who witnessed the spectacle were torn between fascination and horror. A German ambassador once wrote, "He has raised cruelty to the level of art." They were right. Vlad turned impalement into political theater, a psychological operation centuries ahead of its time. He chose his victims carefully. Traitors, thieves, rival nobles, even ambassadors who spoke carelessly. Each impalement served a purpose. To Vlad, mercy was weakness, and weakness invited chaos. He believed only fear could hold a fractured land together. His court chroniclers claimed he would say, "When the body rots, the soul learns obedience." And so the fields of Wallachia bloomed with corpses. To travelers, it was hell on earth. To the prince, it was proof that his kingdom obeyed. But not all deaths were the same. Some were symbolic. A thief might be impaled with his stolen goods dangling from his neck. A liar might have his tongue nailed to the stake before death. Adulterers were often forced to watch each other's impalement. Vlad believed punishment should always reflect the sin. It was his form of justice, cruel but consistent. To his people, this became a paradox. Under Vlad's terror, the roads were safe, the markets honest, the borders secure. No one dared to steal, betray, or cheat. The devil himself, they said, could pass through Wallachia without touching a coin. But that peace came at a cost, an empire built on silence and graves. In the end, impalement was not just execution. It was Vlad's philosophy, his belief that fear was the purest expression of power. He didn't crave blood for pleasure. He craved obedience carved into memory. And memory, as he well knew, lasts far longer than pain. Vlad Țepeș didn't rule with an army, he ruled with an idea, fear. Long before modern propaganda, he understood that terror was the most efficient ruler. Swords could conquer a village, but fear could conquer generations, and Vlad was a master of that unseen empire. He didn't just kill his enemies, he made sure their deaths were remembered. Every impalement, every punishment, every whispered rumor of his cruelty was part of a grander design, a psychological fortress more enduring than any wall. When word spread that Vlad had impaled entire armies, neighboring kingdoms didn't send troops, they sent envoys. The Ottoman soldiers who survived his ambushes returned trembling, describing fields of corpses that stretched beyond sight. Villages surrendered before battle. Nobles stayed loyal, not because they loved him, but because they feared the alternative. He weaponized imagination itself. Vlad knew that fear doesn't need proof, it only needs a story, so he let those stories spread. Some said he drank blood. Others said he dined among the dead. He never denied any of it. Because with every rumor, his legend grew, and so did his control. For the peasants, his brutality was paradoxical. Yes, it terrified them, but it also protected them. No thief dared to steal a loaf of bread. No soldier dared to touch a farmer's daughter. Under Vlad's shadow, even crime was afraid. He was their tyrant, but their own tyrant. To them, his cruelty was a shield against foreign chaos. And that was the genius of his rule. Vlad's violence wasn't random. It was mathematical, calculated, targeted. He once impaled an entire merchant caravan from Saxony after they cheated Wallachian traders. When the surviving merchants complained to their kings, Vlad sent them back, each carrying the severed heads of their comrades. Trade stopped for months. The message was clear: Wallachia would not be exploited. In another instance, when a group of boyars conspired against him, Vlad invited them to a grand Easter feast. They ate, drank, and toasted their prince until soldiers locked the doors. Moments later, they were dragged outside and impaled on stakes surrounding the banquet hall. Their screams, Vlad said, would feed the loyalty of those who remained. This was not madness, it was mathematics of terror. He had turned cruelty into currency, buying peace through pain. To his enemies, he was a demon in flesh. To his people, a god who kept foreign swords away. But to history, he became something more complex, proof that fear, once mastered, can rule longer than love ever could. Even centuries later, his legacy still lingers, not in the soil of Wallachia, but in the human mind. Because Vlad knew the truth that kings and tyrants have whispered ever since: you can kill a man's body, but if you master his fear, you own his soul. In the spring of 1462, a letter crossed the Danube, a letter written not in ink, but in defiance. Vlad the Impaler sent it to Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, a man the world already called the shadow of God on earth. But even shadows fear the dark, and Vlad was the darkest man he'd ever met. The letter was long, sharp, and soaked in contempt. Vlad did not beg for peace. He mocked the Sultan's faith, his armies, and his arrogance. "I have cleansed my land of your dogs," he wrote, referring to the Ottoman envoys he had executed for refusing to remove their turbans. "I nailed their turbans to their skulls so that they might never fall off again." It was an insult meant to burn, and it did. Mehmed's rage was instant. To be defied by a prince so small, so insignificant, was unthinkable. But Vlad wasn't bluffing. He'd spent years preparing for this confrontation, building fortresses, stockpiling weapons, and forging a network of spies within Ottoman territory. He had seen their empire from the inside. He knew how it thought, how it fought. And so he struck first. In a series of surprise attacks across the Danube, Vlad's army unleashed a nightmare. Entire Ottoman outposts vanished overnight, burned to ash, their soldiers impaled in rows that stretched for miles. Vlad didn't just kill the invaders, he made monuments out of them. One chronicler claimed there were 20,000 impaled Turks displayed in the valley of the Danube, so many that Mehmed's army stopped marching out of sheer horror. It wasn't war. It was psychological annihilation. The Sultan, furious yet fascinated, advanced toward Wallachia himself. But when he reached Targovite, he found what would become one of history's most chilling scenes: the infamous Forest of the Impaled. Thousands upon thousands of corpses lined the road, their faces frozen in agony, their bodies arranged like a grotesque greeting. At the center of it all, a massive stake held the body of an Ottoman pasha, still wearing his jeweled armor. The Sultan's horse reared in terror. His men vomited, prayed, and wept. Mehmed looked out over that field and said, "What can be done with a man who does such deeds?" He turned back. Vlad had won, not through battle, but through fear. That letter, the one written in arrogance and iron, had not been a declaration of war. It had been a challenge, a statement of sovereignty from a man who refused to kneel to an empire. It was Vlad saying, "I will not be ruled, not by Rome, not by Constantinople, not by heaven itself." And the Sultan, for all his armies and titles, had no answer to that. Because on that blood-soaked frontier, two legends met, one of conquest and one of defiance. And it was the man called the Impaler who left his mark on history's spine. Power is never lost in battle. It's lost in silence, in whispers, in the trembling hands of those who once swore loyalty. For Vlad Țepeș, betrayal didn't come from a foreign blade. It came from his own blood, his own court, and the very kingdom he had protected with terror. After defying the Sultan and driving back the Ottoman armies, Vlad returned to find his homeland uneasy. The boyars who once bowed before him now whispered his name like a curse. His methods, once praised for keeping Wallachia safe, had turned into symbols of tyranny. Fear, once his greatest weapon, began to corrode his throne from within. Among the conspirators was a familiar name, his own brother, Radu cel Frumos, Radu the Handsome. Radu had spent years in the Ottoman court, raised alongside the Sultan himself. Where Vlad was iron and rage, Radu was silk and persuasion. The Turks saw in him the perfect puppet, a Wallachian prince who spoke their tongue and shared their bed of politics. When Mehmed sought revenge, he didn't send an army this time. He sent Radu. And so began the War of Brothers, a clash not of swords, but of hearts. Radu promised the nobles peace, gold, and mercy if they abandoned Vlad. He promised the peasants freedom from impalement, from war, from fear. One by one, the nobles defected. The same men who had toasted Vlad's victories now opened their gates to Radu's soldiers. Vlad, cornered and furious, fought like a ghost in the forests of Wallachia. His army, outnumbered and exhausted, melted away. When his stronghold fell, he fled north toward Transylvania, seeking aid from the one man he believed might still honor him, King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary. But even that hope was poisoned. The king, under pressure from European powers, terrified of Vlad's brutality, turned against him. He accused Vlad of treachery, forged letters to prove it, and imprisoned him in Buda. For 12 long years, the once feared Impaler rotted in a foreign cell, his enemies feasting on the kingdom he had bled for. The Ottomans celebrated his downfall. Radu ruled Wallachia as their vassal, draped in gold, adored by those who once trembled under his brother's reign. But peace never lasts when it's built on betrayal. Radu's promises faded, corruption bloomed, and chaos returned to the land. In the dungeons of Hungary, Vlad waited, his body weakened, his mind sharpened. He had seen fear control nations. Now he studied how betrayal destroyed them. He whispered to his jailers, to his guards, to the rats that crept across the stone. "They will call me monster," he said, "but monsters never die in silence." He was right. Because history doesn't remember the man who bowed. It remembers the one who burned the world to stay standing. And Vlad Țepeș, the prince they betrayed, the man they caged, was not finished yet. 12 years. That's how long the Iron Prince of Wallachia spent behind stone walls, chained by politics and betrayal. Yet even in captivity, Vlad Țepeș was never truly forgotten, not by his people, not by his enemies, and certainly not by history. In the cold dungeons of Buda, he endured humiliation. He was paraded before nobles as a warning, a savage tamed, the beast who once dined among corpses now reduced to a prisoner of peace. But peace was never in his nature. Vlad was not made for stillness. His eyes, though aged, still burned with that same fire that had terrified the Sultan's armies. Over time, Matthias Corvinus began to reconsider his prisoner. The Ottomans had grown stronger, pressing deeper into Europe, and the Hungarians needed someone ruthless, someone who didn't fear blood. And so, the devil they had caged became the weapon they needed again. In 1476, Vlad was released and restored to his throne. But this was no grand coronation. His kingdom was fractured, his allies gone, and his name spoken only in whispers. Wallachia had changed. The people had grown tired of blood. The nobles who had once betrayed him now feared his vengeance, hiding behind hollow smiles and trembling oaths. Vlad rode to his homeland in silence, his armor blackened, his banner tattered. The peasants stared in disbelief. To them, he was a ghost made flesh, a legend resurrected to finish what death had failed to end. But this time, something in him was different. He had been tempered, not softened. He no longer killed for spectacle. Now, every act of violence was surgical. He executed spies, cleansed traitors, and rebuilt his army from the ashes. Slowly, the fear returned. Not the wild terror of his youth, but a colder, more disciplined dread. When word reached the Ottoman border that Vlad the Impaler had returned, soldiers deserted in waves. Villages fortified themselves. Even the Sultan hesitated, unwilling to provoke another forest of impaled men. The shadow of his legend did the fighting for him. But his second reign was short. Too short. Betrayal had followed him like a curse. Before the year ended, his forces were ambushed near the town of Bucharest. The details remain a blur of myth and blood. Some say he was slain by an Ottoman assassin, others that his own men turned on him in the chaos. What's known is this: Vlad Țepeș fell on the battlefield fighting to the last breath. When they found his body, it was headless. His severed head was sent to Constantinople pickled in honey, presented to the Sultan like a trophy. But even then, the Turks dared not mock him. They displayed his head on the city gates in silence, because even in death, Vlad commanded fear. And that, perhaps, was his truest victory. That no one, not even his enemies, could look upon him without remembering the man who made the world itself tremble. When Vlad Țepeș was killed, history should have buried him. But instead, it began to feed on him. The man was gone, but the monster had just been born. In the years that followed his death, rumors began to twist and multiply like vines through Europe's imagination. German pamphlets told of a sadistic prince who drank his victims' blood, who dined beneath forests of corpses, who impaled thousands and laughed as the air itself stank of death. The printing press was new, and fear sold faster than truth. Vlad's enemies, especially the Saxons who had once traded with Wallachia, saw an opportunity. They painted him not as a ruler defending his land, but as a demon in human form. In one tale, he roasted children and forced their parents to eat them. In another, he mutilated women for minor sins. Truth blurred into myth, myth hardened into legacy, and soon the name Dracula, son of the dragon, was whispered like a curse. But the irony is cruel. Vlad's brutality had been no greater than the world he lived in. The Turks impaled, the Hungarians tortured, the Inquisition burned. Yet it was his name that became eternal, because no one used fear with such artistry. No one made terror into language. Centuries later, those pamphlets found their way into the hands of an Irish writer named Bram Stoker. He was fascinated by Eastern Europe, by old castles, superstition, and the borderlands between faith and damnation. In Vlad's legend, he found everything: a cursed nobleman, a taste for blood, a haunted name, Dracula. Stoker never claimed his vampire was Vlad the Impaler, but the shadow fit too perfectly. The Transylvanian prince who fought the Turks became the immortal count who fought time itself. The Impaler's stakes became fangs, his thirst for vengeance, a thirst for blood. And just like that, Vlad's cruelty became immortality. What's more chilling is how easily the world accepted the story. A man who ruled for survival became a monster for entertainment. The same Europe that once feared him now consumed his legend in theaters, novels, and films. Vlad Țepeș was no longer a prince or a patriot. He was the devil in noble flesh, and perhaps that's what he always wanted: to be remembered, to be feared beyond death. Because that's the difference between a tyrant and a legend. One is forgotten when he dies. The other becomes a myth the world can't kill. Even today, deep in the Carpathians, locals still claim to see his ghost near the ruins of Poenari Fortress. Some say the night wind still carries the screams of the impaled. Others say he walks the forest, searching for those who betrayed him. Vlad the Impaler, the prince of blood and iron, died centuries ago. But Dracula, his creation, his curse, his shadow, will live for eternity. The story of Vlad Țepeș should have ended on the battlefield, beneath the soil of Wallachia. But even in death, the man refused to rest. His body vanished, just as his legend grew immortal. When his decapitated head was sent to Constantinople, the Ottomans mounted it on a pike outside the city walls, a final act of humiliation for the man who had humiliated empires. Yet, no one truly knows what became of the rest of him. His followers claim they buried his body in Snagov Monastery, a small island cloaked in reeds and fog. They said monks carried his remains across the lake at night, chanting prayers as they laid the prince in holy ground. For centuries, pilgrims came to Snagov to kneel before a marble tomb, believing the Impaler lay beneath it. But in 1931, when Romanian archaeologists finally opened the grave, they found nothing. No skeleton, no armor, no trace of the man who terrified kings, only animal bones, scattered and aged. The discovery shook historians and reignited a darker question. Had Vlad's body ever been there at all? Some say the Ottomans took it back after his death, ensuring his soul would never find peace. Others whisper that loyalists moved his remains to Comana Monastery, another of his foundations, where a second unmarked grave was later found. But even that site offers no proof, no inscription, no name, only silence. And in that silence, myth thrives. Romanian folklore insists his spirit still walks the earth, trapped between worlds. To the locals, the empty tomb is no mystery. It's prophecy. A man who impaled his enemies between heaven and hell, they say, could never rest in either. Modern historians call him a national hero, the defender of Christendom. Horror writers call him the father of the vampire. But between those extremes lies a truth far more haunting. Vlad the Impaler was both savior and monster. A man who used fear as justice, who built his throne on blood, and whose death denied him peace. Even today, visitors to Snagov Monastery swear they feel something when they step near the empty tomb. A chill in the air, a whisper in the reeds, the faint metallic scent of iron. Tourists come for curiosity, they leave with unease, because there's something unnatural about a grave without a body. It's as if he refused to be buried at all, and perhaps that's the final punishment, or the final victory. Vlad Țepeș, Prince of Wallachia, scourge of the Sultan, the man history renamed Dracula, may have lost his throne and his life, but never his legend. The earth rejected his body. The world preserved his name, and so the forest still remembers. Every shadow, every rustle, every crimson sunset whispers the same warning. The Impaler never truly died. In the end, the man they called Dracula left behind no body, only terror, legend, and the echo of iron do history. Vlad Țepeș ruled through blood, but what he built was something deeper, a myth that outlived kings and empires. His enemies burned his name, the world made it immortal. Centuries have passed, yet the question remains, was he a monster born of cruelty, or a savior forged by chaos? Perhaps both, because some men are not meant to rest in graves. Some become the darkness itself, and when night falls over Wallachia, his story breathes again,